Excellencies, colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Tori Holt. I'm director of the Dickey Center for International Understanding at Dartmouth and distinguished fellow at the Stimson Center. And you're joining us for an event called Renewable Energy and Peacekeeping in Somalia. I'm honored to be your moderator for today's deep dive into the potential role of renewable energy in peace operations in Somalia. As many of those of you in our audience know, the UN has set an ambitious target to use 80% renewable energy by 2030, a goal that hinges almost exclusively on transitioning peacekeeping and peace operations away from using diesel. The need in turn has spurred a compact between the United Nations, the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, and member states to start assessing concrete projects with a goal to identify 3 initial options by the third quarter of 2022. That's later this year. Over the last year, a group of partners, including Norway, the United Arab Emirates, Energy Peace Partners, and the Stimson Center, have worked together to support a series of discussions to evaluate the feasibility and pathways of this energy transition in UN missions, looking at issues including cost, security, and the legacy for host communities. Typically, these communities are among the world's most energy poor. Our last session was on Mali and the UN mission in MINUSMA. And so now we cross the continent to Somalia, which in many ways has been a trailblazer for renewable use of energy in peace operations. With the groundbreaking solar project in Badoa, it has provided a model where the UN mission, as a large, stable customer, attracts private finance to build new power infrastructure that serves both the United Nations and the community. As a new precedent last month, actually, the Security Council with Resolution 2628 for Somalia, for the first time in Council history, cited the value of renewable energy in its peace operations. So today, we have a remarkable level of expertise to discuss these recent developments as well as potential next steps. I'm actually very delighted of the community we brought together. So I will do my best as moderator to work through these presentations and to hear the diverse perspectives for roughly an hour and 15 minutes, 75 minutes. So we'll start with opening remarks from the UAE and Norway in a minute. We will then turn to the authors of a just released report by Powering Peace called Powering Ahead, the United Nations and Somalia's Renewable Energy Opportunity. A report on renewables in the peace operations and dynamics in Somalia. We'll then turn to key stakeholders with comments from the Special Representative of the Secretary General and Head of the United Nations Assistance Mission in Somalia, Ambassador Swan, and then we'll turn to the CEO of the pioneering energy project developer, Cube. So after that, we'll aim to take several interventions from the floor before turning to IRENA for reflections and wrapping up. So with that wonderful schedule ahead of us, without further ado, please let me turn first to Ambassador Nawal Al-Hassani, the UAE's permanent representative to IRENA. Dr. Nawal, over to you, please. The screen is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Tori. Your Excellencies, colleague, the United Arab Emirates is honored to co-host this event and join our speakers and participants with their exceptional and diverse expertise. This approach of stakeholders speaking candidly about opportunities, risks, but also potential next steps in applied settings is exactly what we had hoped for when we launched this discussion series with Norway and Powering Peace. The communities we are focusing on, like in Somalia, are often the truly last mile for SDG 7 and other SDGs. Conflict and insecurity scare away the vast majority of both public and private finance sources. Yet we know that sustainable peace and recovery are not possible without investment in basic services. And we all know firsthand how essential energy is for job creation, education, health, water, and other sectors. Peacekeeping missions offer a beacon of hope for energy access and infrastructure in fragile communities. They are major energy consumers, sometimes one of the largest in their entire host country, They offer relative security and they pay their bills. They can actually anchor energy systems and attract finance, contributing to a positive impact that outlasts their presence. Because of the cost revolution in renewable energy, these missions, moreover, have a financial incentive to transition to solar, wind, hydro, and other sources. There is a possibility to reduce the bill to member states. We, of course, know that renewable energy is not always the optimal solution for peacekeeping missions. But we also know that electrifying their host communities usually only addresses a fraction of energy access needs in the wider country. But this is a rare alignment of the stars. It behooves us to go through the evaluation process and ask, do renewables make sense in this specific context? This is the core purpose of the Renewables for Peacekeeping initiative that Tori mentioned. It brings together the different mandates of the host country, IRENA, peacekeeping missions, other UN agencies, and additional partners to see if there is a concrete value proposition for renewables in peacekeeping. And then, if there is, to identify who can do what within their mandates to advance a supply option. This is intended to be a very practical exercise. So our hope today is to hear from key actors and experts like His Excellency Swan, Special Representative of the UN Secretary General for Somalia and head of the United Nations Assistance Mission in Somalia, the government, Powering Peace, Cube Energy, and participants in this virtual room, and build consensus on the direction to pursue in the peacekeeping and peace-building context of Somalia. Both as a Security Council member and as a president-designate for COP28, this is a conversation that the UAE looks forward to supporting across host countries. We will want universal energy access. We all want lower operating costs. We all want greater security and faster recovery. Identifying and prioritizing options to address these needs is an important contribution we can make starting today. Thank you again.
Thank you, Dr. Al-Hassani. And I'd now like to turn to your and our co-host, Hans Olav Ibrecht, who is Norway's Special Envoy for Climate and Security. Hans Olav, please, over to you.
Thank you very much, Tori, for giving me the screen. It's a great pleasure on behalf of Norway to wish you all welcome to this event. And it's always hard to follow Dr. Nawal, so let me just add a few issues building on her remarks. But let me from the outset acknowledge our partnership with the UAE and IRENA and the Department of Operations Support and Stimson and Energy Peace Partners. I have to say that I'm really impressed with the work that Stimson and Energy Peace Partners have been doing. I think that we together have made really great progress. Through our partnership and the compact that we launched at a high level of dialogue on energy, we aim to help the UN embrace more efficient and cost-saving technologies and shift to greater use of renewable energy. And this is even more urgent now with the recent IPCC reports as a backdrop, and the UN SG is also a clear call to action to all of us. And then this also then includes the UN walking the talk. The UN Secretariat has developed a 10-year climate action plan with a goal of sourcing 80% of electricity from renewable energy by 2030, and that's a really ambitious statement. And we also have phase 2 of the environment strategy for peace operations of those. So why did Norway pick up this issue of renewable energy and peacekeeping? For us, climate change and renewable energy is a key priority in our foreign and development cooperation policy. Climate change and security is a key priority for our term in the UN Security Council, and we are a large supporter of the UN and to UN peacekeeping operations. So through this partnership, we hope that in the longer term to help the UN better integrate climate solutions in crisis-affected areas as part of the way it does business. I think that's really underscore a point that I'm having, is that this should be mainstream, and this should be part of the UN's daily business. This can support peace building and help to fulfill the ambition to achieve universal global access to energy, the SDG 7 target. The primary arguments for increasing the use of renewable energy in missions is to enhance safety and security, save cost, and leave a positive legacy behind. As Tori also said in the recently approved mandate for UPNIS, we managed to include a request to increase the use of renewable energy, and this was the first time the Security Council recognized this important issue in a resolution. This is the fourth event we are organizing on this topic, and this time we will focus on the situation in Somalia. And without going into details here, the energy practices of the UN in Somalia are similar to those in other international peace operations in fragile contexts. And that means use of diesel generators, which result in sizable footprints in the areas where they are deployed. Significant steps have already been taken in Somalia, and in many ways, I could say that the case of Somalia is a best practice case. Some examples to that effect are that Somalia has in their NDC committed to reduce emissions by 30% by 2030, which also then includes reduction of emissions from the energy sectors. And of course, they need all the help they can get in order to achieve that ambitious target. The UN and the AU missions have clear mandates. We have the first ever dedicated climate security advisor in Somalia, and also the first power purchase agreement with a commercial renewable energy company in the town of Baidoa. And we will hear more about this later. By extending the benefits of new energy access from UN missions to local communities, this can support broader peace and development goals in Somalia and also leave a positive legacy. In closing, the UN in Somalia has taken significant steps, so let me also recognize the leadership of SRSG SWAN. I think that you've actually set a model for other operations, and now we have to build on this leadership and build on the knowledge that we are gaining. We as a community need to provide the necessary expertise. We need to replicate and scale up, and time is of the essence. And finally, as the report states, we have to stop making diesel the default option. Renewable energy should be the preferred option, and the case for action is clear. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hans Olaf. I want to thank you and your colleagues from Norway, as well as Dr. Nawal Hassani and the UAE leadership on this. You've given us a sense of urgency and focus that builds off what the UN is trying to do with its environment strategy, with the work in the field missions with DPO, and the work of organizations like IRENA. But none of this would be possible really without the member state leadership that you all both have offered, so thank you. I'm very pleased now to turn us to the details of what's happening in Somalia, both through the lens of this report, and then we will also turn to SRSG SWAN. But to start first with this report, set the scene. So it's my colleagues with Powering Peace, which has been mentioned already. It's a joint initiative of the Stimson Center and Energy Peace Partners. And the report they will be discussing has just been published called Powering Ahead, the United Nations and Somalia's Renewable Energy Opportunity. As far as we know, it is the first comprehensive study of the energy landscape and the UN's purchasing power in Somalia. And to follow the last two speakers, it's very practical, and it focuses both on what the environment is and what the mission could do better. So the report looks at the past, present, and future of renewable energy for the UN and the African Union missions. And in particular, it examines an emerging model of peacekeepers buying power from the local market. So I will now turn to our three speakers for this section of the discussion. First two are the lead authors of the report. Abdi Inte, who's the managing director of Lasfer Consulting Group. I will then turn to Eugene Chen, known to many in the UN community and currently a visiting scholar at NYU Center on International Cooperation. And then we'll have final remarks from Dave Mazursky, who is the president of Energy Peace Partners. So let me kick off first. Abdi, over to you.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, colleagues. Can you hear me clearly, Tori?
Yes,
Okay.
you're coming through. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll try and maximize my 6 minutes to the best I can. By starting off with the context of Somalia, many of you would know that this country has been going through some 30 years of instability, which is still ongoing, although things are, in general terms, improving. And when we speak of the energy sector, we speak of it within that context, knowing that this country essentially did not have the capacity to rebuild its energy sector at all for the last 30 years. In fact, Somalia never had a national grid in the first place. Even before the war in 1991, it had a basic a grid within the capital Mogadishu, and there were barely any electricity outside of Mogadishu, even though Somalia is a fairly large country, the size of Texas, for those of you in the US. And even today, 30 years later, electricity generation remains extremely low, about 125 megawatts installed capacity. So you can imagine how extremely small that is. And access to energy and electricity in general is very, very low. Only about 30% of the population have access to electricity. And that is driven both by lack of infrastructure, national grid, and so on. But importantly, it's also driven by the fact that the cost of electricity is astonishingly high. It's one of the highest in the world, if not the highest. As of today, the average kilowatt hour of electricity cost is about 55 cents US dollars, that is. So almost slightly more than half a dollar. And in most of the cities across the country, it's almost a dollar. You know, when I say 55 cents, I am talking about only major cities like Mogadishu. And another important element in all of this is that the energy sector is highly decentralized and localized, meaning in the absence of national grid, you have electricity companies, what we call ESPs, the electricity service providers, who are providing these services at local communities all across the country. So it's essentially not connected to one another. That said, Somalia actually has one of the highest potentials for renewable energy among other countries in Africa. It has the highest onshore wind power in Africa, or highest potential for onshore wind power in Africa, and 3,000 hours of sunlight annually. So if we want to go solar, it is essentially a perfect place to do that. What are the main challenges? So in the report, we identify a lot of challenges, but let me just point out a number of main challenges to electrify the country, but also to leapfrog into renewable energy. I think right now within the 125 installed megawatt installed capacity, only about 10% of that is now generated through renewable energy, and the vast majority of that is generated through solar power. One of the reasons why the country was unable to move into or to accelerate that across the country is the lack of financing. Essentially, companies have to count on their own capital to try and upgrade their systems, or to buy solar systems or wind systems. The banks in the country are only starting to do financing in the last few years. And so within that space, companies are relying on their own financing. Another main challenge is the very weak governance, in that the government itself still lacks the capacity to provide oversight as well as regulations over the electricity service providers and on the energy sector in general, meaning that the whole operations is driven by the private sector for the most part. Now, what are the links to peace and security in the country? There's a lot of them, but I think the most important one we discovered in the report is the fact that because the vast majority of the electricity in the country is generated through diesel-powered generators, they need diesel. And so diesel moves across the country, and major supply routes across this country are controlled by Al-Shabaab. the militant group, and they are taxing the diesel that is going across the country and generating enormous amount of money from that. That's a main huge problem and a link to peace and security. And if we were able to, for example, not need to ferry diesel around the country, that will deprive Al-Shabaab significant resources from them. Let me conclude by focusing on the key recommendations. And we've made a lot of recommendations in the report, but I'll focus on just the key ones. First one is that the government needs to strengthen its regulatory and oversight capacity so that it can engage more effectively with the electricity service providers and support them. Secondly, the government would have to incentivize renewable energy. At the moment, the 10% renewable energy that exists in the country is largely driven by the private sector who are seeing the benefits of it. But if the government were to incentivize, we see that there is a greater potential for growth in that sense. Thirdly, we are recommending that the federal government and what we call federal member states in Somalia would need to harmonize their policies when it comes to the energy sector. At the moment, not only is the provision of electricity highly decentralized, but also the policy landscape is equally decentralized, creating problems and duplications and sometimes contradictions. And finally, we are recommending that the government promotes a public-private partnership model to catalyze more renewable energy across the country. And there is a great deal of potential, by the way. A lot of the private companies we spoke to were willing to partner with the government and scale up their renewable energy uptake if they were able to engage with the government. So I think I've gone a minute over my 6 minutes. So back to you, Tori. Thank you.
Thank you, Abdi. And I know that this work is based on months of interviewing in the field, talking about climate development finance and with local actors and studying the complicated energy market. And you've broken it down very nicely. It's going to be hard for any of us to forget that while there's only 30% access to energy, and of that only 10% is renewable. So the potential you sketch is very impressive. Let me turn next to Eugene Chen. Over to you, Eugene, for our next part of this conversation.
Thanks so much, Tori, and thanks to Norway and UAE for their support for this overall initiative. Thanks to the Powering Peace team, and of course, thanks to all the UN staff in Somalia and at HQ who've been working tirelessly to move the ball forward. As was noted previously, large UN presences rely heavily on diesel generators for their electricity requirements, and Somalia is certainly no exception. The UN Support Office in Somalia, UNSOS, was originally established back in 2009 to serve as the logistics tail for the African Union mission in Somalia. And today, it not only supports the over 19,000 authorized now ATMIS uniform personnel, but it also serves as the mission support component for the UN Assistance Mission in Somalia, UNSOM, established in June 2013. Now, we all know, of course, that the Security Council recently endorsed the reconfiguration of AMISOM into ATMIS, but in my remarks, I'm going to continue to refer to AMISOM, mostly because the report that we drafted focused on the UN support given to AMISOM, even if the conclusions are still broadly applicable to ATMIS. Now, the majority of the UN fuel consumption in Somalia is either in support of AMISOM operations or provided directly to AMISOM contingents for their major equipment, including for both vehicles and generators. And in fact, over 80% of the diesel consumption in Somalia is for electricity generation, and most of the remainder is for vehicles. One of the striking statistics that we found in our research was the fact that the total generating capacity of the UN is equivalent to over half of the total installed local grid capacity in Somalia. Now, although UNSOS supports AMISOM on the basis of UN standards, there are still several differences between AMISOM and UN peacekeeping operations in terms of logistics and administration. And one notable area is force generation, and this does affect generators and other fuel-consuming equipment. In normal UN peacekeeping missions, statements of unit requirements are prepared based on military and police concepts of operation in order to establish the capabilities, tasks, and requirements of individual military and police units. As part of the fourth generation process, memorandums of understanding are negotiated with individual troop and police contributors on the basis of these statements of unit requirements to establish the number of personnel, the equipment, and the self-sustainment capabilities that need to be deployed. In AMISOM, however, the absence of statement of unit requirements meant that the memorandums of understanding signed between the UN, the AU, and the troop and police contributing countries were concluded on the basis of what equipment was already deployed and present on the ground, as opposed to the equipment that was actually needed for the mission. And as a result, many categories of major equipment, including generators, are deployed far in excess of operational requirements. Now, one of the major obstacles certainly experienced in Somalia, but also applicable across peacekeeping operations writ large, is the fact that the United Nations provides fuel at no cost to troop and police contributing countries. So there's very little incentive for troop and police contributing countries to conserve fuel or to make the capital investments required to procure hybrid or renewable energy platforms to replace their existing fuel consuming equipment. Now, more broadly, much of the UN reliance on diesel for electricity across all peace operations is inertia, and it was mentioned previously. As we know from behavioral science, defaults are powerful, and right now, diesel is the default in most missions. The established policies and procedures at the UN for setting up and maintaining a large footprint involve the deployment of diesel generators. So breaking the cycle really requires the stars to align with key positions across missions filled by proactive and like-minded staff who also have the backing of mission leadership. And Somalia is one place where the stars seem to have aligned and some progress have certainly been made. This also means, however, that progress can be set back indefinitely when even just one key personnel, one key individual in a key position departs. And so it's very important to try to institutionalize as much of these mindsets as possible. Now, although the Secretariat has established ambitious targets under its climate action plan, to most staff in the field, these are kind of more abstract headquarters constructs that are not necessarily reflected in either their job descriptions or their performance evaluations. And therefore, there isn't a broad sense of ownership of these targets. Now, member state support and reporting requirements to intergovernmental bodies can help ensure forward momentum on some of these targets. Some proactive and environmentally minded UNSOS staff have certainly taken steps within the bounds of their job descriptions to take steps as reducing electricity use, improving fuel efficiency, limiting fuel consumption, and installing solar panels. And while these steps are all extremely commendable, they're not enough to break the reliance of the mission on diesel. In Somalia, however, UNSOS may have found a solution in the form of a power purchase agreement with a renewable energy company in Baidoa, southwest state, which provides the potential for allowing the UN to shift a significant amount of its electricity generation to renewable sources within the framework of its existing regulations and rules. And of course, Dave and Mads will speak more about this in just a moment. But before I wrap up my remarks, I also wanted to highlight that in Somalia, the UN has also started to recognize the impact of mission support activities on security and sustainable development. Traditionally, the siloization within individual missions meant that most mission support staff considered peace and security and development to be considerations only for substantive units or the country team. Now, an important factor in this more comprehensive understanding of the contributions and impact of all mission components in all parts of the UN system is the presence of a dedicated climate security advisor in UNSOM, who reports to the Deputy Special Representative, the Secretary General, who's also triple-hatted as the RC and HC. Having such a capacity is definitely something that should be considered for broader adoption across all peace operations because of how important it has been in Somalia. I will wrap up there. Thank you so much. Over.
Thank you, Eugene, and thank you for your ability to look at systems and not just give up when you find inertia, but to break them down and think about how to realign incentives. So thank you. Let me turn next to Dave Mazurski to wrap up this part of our discussion of the cool new report.
Thank you, Tori, and thank you to our co-hosts, Norway and the UAE, and esteemed speakers and guests. We've been running the Powering Peace initiative together with the Stimson Center for the last several years, and we've developed research and country case studies looking at energy practices in UN peacekeeping as a whole, as well as options for UN peace operations to transition to renewable energy in South Sudan, DRC, Mali, and now Somalia, and how these transitions can help support both climate and peace building efforts. One of the challenges that came up again and again was that the annual funding cycles of UN missions made it difficult for the missions to self-procure large renewable energy systems because of the high upfront cost. One solution that we've seen take hold in the renewable energy sector around the world is through partnership with the private sector. In this case, turning the UN into an energy consumer rather than producer through a power purchase agreement or PPA. This model has the UN acting as an anchor client, committing to buy the clean energy produced, while the renewable energy company finances and builds the project. The PPA project in Baidoa with UNSAS, Cube Energy, and the government of Southwest State is the first of its kind for any UN peace operation. And it's a testament to the leadership of those involved that they persevered in moving this project towards implementation, despite significant obstacles. We believe that the PPA model offers a viable and necessary path for UN peacekeeping to meet its UNSCAP renewable energy and climate goals. We therefore tried to identify some of the lessons learned from the Baidoa project to see how the PPA model could be scaled to help meet the UN's climate goals, while also supporting local energy sectors and advancing peace building efforts. On the plus side, once completed, there will be a new 2 megawatt solar system in Baidoa, which currently has some of the highest energy costs in Somalia and the wider region, and where the mission has been flying in its fuel due to insecurity on the roads. This project will provide renewable energy to the UN and AU missions, as well as local government, health sector, and local consumers. Second, this project model solves the upfront financing challenge for the UN, as the private sector partner financed and will develop the project. The UN has committed to purchase the clean energy generated, which helped to unlock the project financing. Third, it will be cheaper, cleaner, and brings new investment into Somalia's energy sector. In addition, ownership of the project will be handed to the local government after 15 years. It's a win-win-win project model. One finding which deserves further consideration is that the bulk of the work and responsibility in pulling this project together rested on the private sector partner, Cube Energy. There was support from the mission behind the scenes, but it was the private sector partner that had to pull all the pieces together. In fact, the UN mission's limited investment and involvement was seen as a positive within the mission, in that it managed to outsource risk and responsibility to the private sector. While that is understandable, it gives pause when considering how widely the UN will be able to replicate this model in other challenging settings. I would suggest that to see this PPA model scaled, the UN also needs to be able to initiate and catalyze projects like this, working with host governments and the private sector to make these happen. That's part of what is envisioned with the new energy compacts, but it's still early days and wider international support will likely be needed. Nevertheless, I think the general takeaway is very encouraging, and we hope that it can be replicated elsewhere in Somalia and beyond. Thank you, Tori, and thank you. I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you, Dave. It's good to get your broad perspective across the multiple reports. But let me now turn after this panel to the next section of the discussion from stakeholders in Somalia. And I could not be more delighted that we're able to then, in a moment, turn to Ambassador James Swan, who is the special representative of the UN Secretary General for Somalia and head of the UN missions there. So, SRSG Swan, if I may just set up a few questions which you can choose to answer or not. You have been one of the most active proponents for renewable energy transitions in UN missions, and you actually helped pave the way for looking into these sort of issues, as well as for new power projects that aim to benefit outside the fence, to deliver benefits outside the fence. So we would love to hear your rationale, why this makes sense for the missions, and what are the benefits of renewable energy in Somalia, steps that you think have allowed projects to get off the ground in a complicated environment, but also your keen analysis of cases of over-optimism if those are not warranted. And then how will you recommend to us future collaboration with the private sector, as well as how to support the Security Council's mandate on positive legacy, as well as a reality check on getting to the goal of being the UN being based 80% on renewable energy by 2030. I think I've just asked you way too many questions, but that should at least kick off the conversation. Over to you, SRSG Swan.
Okay, yes, thank you very much, Tori, and greetings to those on the screen from UAE, Norway, the other participants. Thank you for inviting me. And let me start by saying thank you very much for the report, Powering Ahead. I think it is very well researched, well documented, and obviously benefited from some very smart people who know these issues. And I think the findings are useful and the recommendations thoughtful and warrant our consideration. So I think it's been a helpful contribution, and I personally have learned from it. So thank you very much. Maybe just a word on at least how I see the renewables issue. I mean, at the end of the day, as SRSG or as a UN mission mandated by the Security Council, our main goal is to implement the Security Council mandate. At the end of the day, that's our job. So I think we see renewables and increasing renewables, yes, as absolutely the right thing to do from an environmental standpoint, from a carbon footprint reduction standpoint, from a support for addressing climate change in the way that each of us can contribute a little bit. But we also see it really as quite fundamental to improving our own mandate delivery. As Dave mentioned, currently our missions, UN missions in Somalia, are flying 2 million liters of fuel around the country annually. This is obviously a huge cost. It's a risk in terms of security. It's a risk in terms of accountability. And so finding ways to deliver electricity, to obtain electricity closer to point of use has tremendous benefits for achievement of the mandate. So I think we need to see it not just as an environmental and climate related imperative, but as beneficial to achievement of the mandate itself. So we've made increased use of renewables a priority. There's no question that the original thinking around the Baidoa power purchase agreement was very much an innovation of some individuals who saw this opportunity and explored it and developed it further. But we are seeking to institutionalize that, and through active engagement across the UN system, including bringing in the climate advisor, including close collaboration between UNSOM and UNSOS, to make this more meaningful and an overarching priority for our mission. I think we're having some impact in that regard, and we want to continue to make that a priority. As we look ahead to what can be achieved against the 80% renewables goal, I think our conclusion here is the only way to do that is through bold and innovative effort, that tweaking at the margins or the efficiency of our air conditioners or how much lighting we're using or insulation for the containers is not going to achieve those sorts of significant gains. And so there needs to be innovation, and the power purchase agreement option obviously represents just that kind of innovation. But it needs to be, of course, scaled further. And I think as we're looking ahead, we are identifying already other locations in Somalia where that power purchase approach could be replicated in the coming 5 years. We are also looking at opportunities to source power from existing power generating companies that are using more renewable energy than we are using internally through a largely diesel generated effort. But I think a key conclusion for us is this is going to require some creativity and some boldness. And so again, the report has been helpful in pointing us to some options in that regard. And then finally, I just wanted to mention a point that was also highlighted, I think, by several of the earlier presenters. And that's this matter of the positive legacy that ultimately UN peace operations do come to an end in most cases. And there is a question after years, in some cases decades, of presence in a country, what are we leaving behind that will be supportive of that population? And again, the power purchase approach, especially when configured as a public-private partnership, and in the case of the Baidoa project, to be turned over to the Southwest state authorities after 15 years, will provide that sort of positive legacy and leave something behind for the Somali people. So maybe a final point is simply, I do want to underscore our strong commitment on these issues. As with many grand objectives, our challenge somewhat is to operationalize them. And so we've again benefited from the report. We've benefited from good support from Department of Operations support, and we look forward to continuing to advance this, including in the context of the compact, along with IRENA, UAE, and Norway. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, SRSG. And I appreciate you grounding us in your first point, which is this needs to serve the mission, and your clear explanation of how you think it is linked exactly to the mission, but also your call for sort of bold thinking and innovation. And during the question and answer period, we may come back a bit to you on that as well. Much more to discuss. Let me turn now, though, to our second colleague here on this subject, particularly looking at what's happening in Somalia. And I'm very pleased today that, and we are fortunate to have Mads Olin Hansen, who is a CEO of Cube Energy, which has already come up a number of times. They are the private sector developer behind the legendary Baidoa project, and they are now working on a second solar project. Mads, could you tell us from Cube's perspective, what actions and financing enabled Baidoa and your next project to move from sort of concept to development? What do you see as precedents, and how do they portend for future renewable energy mission and host communities in Somalia? Thank you for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Tori, and thank you for those kind words. Maybe I could start just by giving a bit of a background to the development of the Baidoa project to sort of inform what actions and what type of financing made it come or become a reality. So we started working on the Baidoa power plant in 2018. So we originally went to Baidoa to meet with the UN agencies operating in the area and to evaluate how they could cut costs and emissions by increasing the use of solar to offset their diesel generation. But during our initial visit to Baidoa, the government of the Southwest state contacted us and urged us not just to focus on the international organizations in isolation, but rather to include the local populations in the plans as well. So the government, from their perspective, they wanted to increase the investment in electricity infrastructure for the city of Baidoa. So this kind of approach made a lot of sense for them. But for us, it was a big departure for how we had previously operated, where we would normally look at the installation of solar equipment inside a UN agency or NGO's compound. We would now have to look at essentially the formation of a grid that would connect local populations in addition to the UN. This is made the investment in the infrastructure much more expensive, so almost twice as much as our original plans for the project. And it sort of exposed us in a very different ways to the authorities and sort of the permitting and regulations of Somalia, which is somewhat underdeveloped. And I think essentially it also included a lot of financial risk because the UN or international organizations as us takers have a very different credit rating or credit worthiness, if you may, than the local population, which impacts the way that we could access international financial markets. But for us, it also was a big opportunity. One of the biggest challenges of serving the UN and other NGOs with electricity from solar is that their time horizons for their operations is uncertain. So for a solar plant, it has a very high upfront cost, and it basically pays itself off by having a very long life expectancy. For solar, it's more than 30 years. But by having the UN connected with the local communities, if we or when we do face a situation of scaling down the international operation, we are then in a position that we can scale up the amount of electricity that we could serve the local populations, which will greatly increase the impact of the project. Furthermore, having the UN as part of the project has had a huge impact on the cost of capital for bringing the project forward. So the UN, with its very large electricity consumption, made it possible to approach investors internationally and international financing mechanisms like MIGA to bring down the cost of capital greatly for the project. Secondly, the implementation of the project is happening in an incredibly complex environment, and we've benefited tremendously from champions working within the UN in Baidoa that has helped us sort of address challenges that otherwise would have stopped the project, and that's an engagement that we sort of continue to rely on today, sort of in the very challenging execution process of constructing the plant. On the scaling up, I'm hugely optimistic. I think that the ingredients for the project in Baidoa has the components that not only can be scaled across the mission locations in Somalia, but on a global scale. I think from a financing and execution point of view, there's no reason why 80 to 90% of missions shouldn't be able to be supplied by renewable energy within 5 years. Never less 2030. So I think it's about getting the structure of these type of projects right. I think from when it comes to maybe two big challenges that we see as a developer, it's that I think the UN at a global point of view has to come to terms with how to deal with external developers running these type of processes, in the sense that it's very often the mission sites are in areas that don't have very good commercial options for logistics, such as flights and accommodation. So I think the UN, what's the policy in terms of inviting private sector to come and drive these type of projects, given the lack of infrastructure? And I think the second part relates to just preparing for the transition to renewables. And I think that a big component of that is just starting to measure how much electricity they're using in each location where they operate. I think with those type of, if those two elements are in place, my estimate is that the transition to renewables would be much faster than perhaps many people think. I think I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you very much, Mads. Perhaps before I leave both of you, a question to you on this panel. The government of Somalia, if you look at Somalia's own ambitions related to climate change, they care a lot about resilience and energy access, as well as mitigation. And so I'm wondering, both SRSG Swan and also CEO Mads, if that conversation combined with the assets of the UN's funding for long-term, not just security for the mission, but also development, is an active conversation, or how would you see the UN Compact and some of the work we've been describing today kind of help work with the Somali government and governance and communities to accelerate a use of renewable energy, if that's an area you think is fruitful? Jim, over to you first.
Yes, I'm happy to start. Thanks, Tori. Well, first of all, as with many issues that have been somewhat on hold because of the political situation in Somalia, we would hope that a more in-depth and thoughtful and forward-looking discussion on these topics could be launched once the elections come to a conclusion. But even under the current circumstances, there are pockets of real interest within the Somali government in regard to climate issues. For example, there's been strong support for a water management strategy, which is very much influenced by impacts of climate change. Also, Somalia has recently invited IGAD to establish an environmental center in Mogadishu. So there is a certain level of interest that I think we can continue to develop. I would note also that, of course, your co-hosts today, Tori, both Norway and UAE have very strong relationships in Somalia and could perhaps also help energize that conversation. But let me make just perhaps one final point, which is, I think one of the other panelists noted the need for us to tap into additional expertise from those who are knowledgeable about renewables and about innovative ways to draw on renewable sources of power. And I think that need, that thirst really for more expertise cuts across, let's be honest, the United Nations. I think we have a lot of very capable people, but has not been a core part of our business really. And so developing that expertise is important. I think it's also, frankly, important for the Somali government because it too struggles with some of the complexities of innovation in this area. And even at the federal member state level, I think this was perhaps one of the elements that was a challenge in negotiating the agreement with the Somali authorities was that, in fact, there was a lack of familiarity with the whole power purchase model and details of that, and even how to work with international firms in this sort of context. So I think there's great opportunity for expertise from those with experience in this area for the government, for the UN, and for other actors in Somalia.
That's fantastic. Really useful points. And I think those are areas we could also follow up on. Mads, let me turn to you for any other thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very good question. And sort of dealing with regulations and sort of how to proceed with renewable energy, which in many cases can be much more decentralized than I think how power grids are set up in sort of more mature markets. It's very complex. And I think what we've seen is that particularly perhaps at state level in Somalia, where the capacity of different government entities of going forward with sort of essentially creating these type of regulations and having to make decisions on how to design the energy market, it's, you know, their capacity is very limited. And I think in many cases they feel that they perhaps don't have a lot of support for how to go forward. And in essence, you know, they're turning to us to ask us to help them with this. I similarly to SRSG Swan, perhaps would turn to member states to see if there's any way that they can support decision makers at the local level that essentially take a lot of these decisions that has huge impact for how sort of the environment will be for constructing renewable energy at a local level in Somalia will be.
All right, well, thank you very much. All right, we'll now turn to, in a moment, I'd like to encourage the audience, if you'd like to ask a question or make a comment in the box, please either put up your hand or type in a question. I see some coming up already, and I'd like to welcome the whole panel back for this section where we can have a bit more of a discussion. Matt, there was a quick question to you, and then I'll read a broad one for everybody. There's a question about what the finance mechanism was that you briefly mentioned, a finance fund or something. The person asked the question said, was it MIGA, but could you maybe clarify what the fund was that you had mentioned?
Yeah, so the plant itself is financed by equity capital. So there we have international investors that have provided that equity upfront. But the project is going forward with MIGA guarantees that come in to secure or to reduce the political risk of the project in the event that something would happen sort of more politically based in the in Baidoa.
Okay, thank you very much. All right. I see some questions coming in, so I will read off a few. This one's very broad. And so it's really for anyone on our panel today in our discussion, including our authors. How can we spread the word that the United Nations and missions are ready and willing to purchase renewable energy as a service? What are the next steps for encouraging further engagement with the private sector? And I do want to bring back Eugene and Abdi and Dave for any of this kind of conversation, because I think together with MADS and the SRSG, we have a pretty complete picture here. So does anyone want to sort of think about that? How do we have more of an understanding that the UN may be able to treat energy as a service and buy it? And this might get into the complexity that's been described in Baidoa and elsewhere. Also, Eugene, I see you're on the screen. I think you also appreciate what I called earlier the incentive and disincentive system, but maybe you'd call it the inertia and the inertia removal system. So let me turn over to you if you're game to take that question.
Thanks so much, Tori, and thanks to Alex for the question. I think here, of course, the two of the biggest obstacles to greater use of this type of approach, I think, really come down to mindset and methodologies. On the mindset side, of course, we've already discussed the fact that we need to stop treating diesel as the default. But I know that in conversations with individuals working in mission support in a lot of areas, one common refrain is the fact that electricity generation is so critical to missions that it's not something that should be trusted to be outsourced to others. But there's ways around this particular problem. For example, in Baidoa, the PPA doesn't mean that the UN is just going to throw away its diesel generators. They'll still be there on standby to be able to be used in case there's some sort of disruption to supply once everything is operational. I think on the methodology side, one thing to keep in mind also is the need to kind of have a better understanding of costs when going into the procurement process. The financial rules and regulations of the UN establish a number of principles for governing procurement, and one of these is best value for money. Now, it's also oftentimes very tempting to just look at, what is the price for a kilowatt hour between, diesel or renewables or others. And of course, oftentimes renewables may seem to be more expensive, oftentimes because there's that upfront capital cost for installing the new systems and things like that. But there are much broader costs that need to be factored in. So for example, diesel in a place like Somalia, we need to factor in costs like what Ambassador Swan pointed out earlier about the fact that the UN ferries more than 2 million liters of diesel by air, therefore expending Jet A1 and every year. There's also safety and security considerations for troops that need to escort fuel convoys. There's also the environment and long-term development impact of use of fuel. These are all costs that actually also need to be captured in some way when making the determination of what in fact is the optimal approach to generating electricity. Now, of course, the calculation is going to be different in every location and every mission, but having this broader understanding of what total life cycle costs are would also help break some of these procurement mindsets that oftentimes preclude looking too closely at new approaches at the UN. Over.
Eugene, that's a very good point, and I think it touches on both your analysis, but others here, and how you would build a model that was country specific or mission specific to capture all the actual costs associated with the different options for energy access. So I think that's a very good point. I also see another question here. We may have others who want to speak in person, but also to talk about that a bit. There's a question, how can we talk about the potential peace building benefits that energy access gains in fragile states could lead to? So this is both, I think, specific to Somalia, but others here may have views on other missions or other ways that peace building is considered. It also may be a source of finance, potentially if it's seen through the development lens, as part of a peace building strategy or a climate mitigation strategy. So I throw that open. I don't know if SRSG Swan has a view on that from his perspective.
Yes, certainly. And I'm sure others want to come in as well. And maybe just to frame it at the beginning, of course, we see climate issues as affecting the peace building agenda very directly, and are looking at a number of ways that using a climate lens, we can address local reconciliation more effectively, and help to support stabilization in communities that are particularly hard hit by environmental devastation. Obviously, it's especially germane today because of the drought that is affecting more than 6 million people in Somalia right at the moment. So that's some 40% of the population. But I think in terms of broader connections to peace building, I think clearly that the ability of communities to access electricity and access electricity at a reasonable cost will contribute greatly to stabilization in those zones. This is frankly a matter that the country, but also its supporting international partners have struggled with for many years, that even when there have been areas of the country in which the government is able to reassert its presence from a security standpoint or from an administrative governance standpoint, the ability to actually change the lives of people, to have opportunities for economic development, to be able to put in place schools, health services, judicial services, has been a tremendous struggle. Now, electricity alone is not going to solve that problem, but it certainly would be a substantial contributor to an improved situation and would reinforce this approach. I mean, again, sometimes the external approach in Somalia is caricatured as a very military-centric approach, but really it is a more balanced effort, which is designed on the one hand to contain al-Shabaab, but on the other hand, to support establishment of Somali national institutions that can offer a better life and a better model for the people. Thanks.
Thank you, SRSG. You very gently reminded us of how challenging Somalia is, much beyond the topic today. And indeed, this is such an important conversation about how that situation moves forward. Mads, I'm going to turn to you next with a question that's specific to you, but also one that I think would interest a lot of people. It's the question says that you mentioned how the Baidoa project is operating in a complex environment and that the UN has helped to address challenges that perhaps you wouldn't have been able to address on your own, if that's correct. Could you elaborate a bit? I mean, a census gets to where there could be potential partnerships, both for Somalia, but also in other such environments.
No, I think it comes down to many things. I mean, most recently, when we started the construction of the power plant in Baidoa, very soon after the clearing of the land started, we had issues with a ammunition depot that was stationed very close to the land that we had been provided by the government. And for a private company like ours, it's very difficult to have the sort of the local footprint required to be able to deal with going forward from that. I think the UN in Baidoa have extremely skilled people that have networks that they can draw on in handling those type of situations, and which I think from the private sector it would be almost impossible to try to replicate. So I think that's just a very concrete example of how the UN has been a sort of a centerpiece of trying to maintain the mobility of the project when we have met very sort of big challenges. I think in terms of replicating that beyond Baidoa, I think it comes a bit down to as I mentioned in my answer previously, the UN having to take some perhaps decisions on a policy level on how to deal and how to support this type of private sector sort of driven projects in essence, and how comfortable the UN is in sort of supporting projects where, you know, in some cases it's not able to run perhaps as a competitive process as you would in more developed locations. So I think that's that's a policy decision that needs to be made.
Very good. I see two more questions that maybe I'll call out to the group and make sure we have comments on before we turn to wrapping up with our colleague from IRENA, Elizabeth Press. So here's an interesting turn on a question. One of comes to us that says, we're talking about missions who are acting as a number of missions are acting as power producers and not power consumers. Have any of you done a study on these projects? And has there been any successes? And so I'm wondering, and they recognize that the UN could become, if it becomes mostly a consumer, is that risky for the UN missions? I don't know if Dave or others here, Hans Olaf, have thought about this issue. It's a good point about how this is there could be a two-way street here. Let me open up to anybody, and if not, we have yet another question I will follow up with. Abdi, did you want to join this one?
Sure, Tori. This sort of also is connected to a previous question about the role of the private sector or the role of the missions in generating and consuming power. In doing research for this study, one of the points that was raised by the largest electricity company here in Mogadishu is that even though they are able, capable, and willing to generate and sell electricity to the mission, they were unable to do that for all sorts of reasons. They've been in discussions with UNSOS for 3 years, and they felt that the bureaucracy of it was stymieing, and a lot of it was connected to perhaps security concerns and other concerns. This is to say that I think there is a space here for missions to incentivize the private sector to generate renewable energy by actually buying from the private sector. And a lot of the cities across the country, as I had mentioned, are doing, a lot of these small companies are now able to generate. So I think we can incentivize them. I think what CUBE is doing in Baidoa is great. But let's remember that there are local companies that have the capacity, that are able to do, that should be incentivized as well.
Thank you. That I think is really helpful. Hans Olaf.
Thank you. Just to add a few comments, not specifically at the last question, but to build a little bit on what SRSG-1 just mentioned, also in terms of peace building impacts. We've also supported street lighting in Somalia, and I think that actually also has a tremendous impact in building, at least reducing risks and enhancing safety for the local populations. I think it's also an issue that is worth considering. And when it comes to this, who else? It's not only the UN missions. Of course, we have all the humanitarian agencies that are struggling with the same issue, and they operate about the same number of diesel generators as UN missions. And of course, through the Global Program of Action, we are also working with them to ensure that humanitarian agencies also switch to renewable energy. And then, of course, we have our own embassies or missions. And I definitely, since I use the term walking the talk to the UN, of course, that applies to us as well. We need to do something in our own house to put that in order as well. And I think, honestly speaking, we are faced with some of the same challenges as the UN have been in terms of doing so. In terms of what we are also doing, we've mentioned that a key role that we could play as member states is, of course, to ensure that SRSG-1 and its colleagues have the right mandates and also the right resources in terms of both technical expertise as well as the budgets. So we, from our side, will also provide dedicated support to climate security advisors to various missions, and other donors are doing that as well. So I think for me also, the 2 million liters that SRSG-1 mentioned, that's a really underscores the case here that we are then transporting this around the country by air. And I also heard from Afghanistan that it cost about $500 to bring a gallon of fuel to Bagram Air Force Base. And then if you start adding up the fuel consumption and the cost then of just doing that, it's just tremendous. And of course, also the security risks associated with the transport. Thank you.
Thank you, Hans Olaf. And in a moment, I'll turn to Dave and then to Ambassador Swan for final remarks before we conclude. But maybe a thought for member states such as yourself. One of the things that's come up, and the SRSG pointed this out, that we need innovation and acceleration. And so I think it's a little vague to most how the Secretary General's ambitious goals of being 80% based on renewable energy by 2030 will actually be met. So maybe that's a question to the within the Secretariat by member states to ask that specifically, as well as taking Eugene Chen's wonderful presentation of how to capture costs around energy and creating a model that could be used for missions to really right-size that analysis. Dave, over to you, and then I will turn to SRSG Swan. Oh.
Thank you, Tori. Just a few brief remarks at the end on the peace building question, drawing on the research that we've done across a few different countries and a few different missions. On the one hand, we have seen in every country we've looked at that local diesel markets overlap with the war economy in some way. In Somalia, we've heard, we found similar localized dynamics in South Sudan and DRC in Northern Mali. So I think that is it's not a constant, but it's a commonality in settings with UN peacekeeping missions, with conflict. Secondly, that I would point out that renewable energy is a growth sector, and we should bear that in mind, that investment in renewable energy creates jobs, it creates opportunities. And again, pulling from a previous Powering Peace event that we did together, we heard from Virunga Energies in Eastern DRC, for each megawatt hour that they brought online and distributed to the communities, that was first time electrification, they estimated that it created between 800 to 1,000 jobs. 11% of those went to former combatants. So the local context is different in each case, but I think particularly where the project is providing first time electrification or new electrification, the benefits are outsized. And then the third point is perhaps a framework for thinking about this across countries, but in a UN context, is in the context of peace dividends. These projects create new opportunities and new openings as peace dividends. And the local opportunity is contextual and is different in each case. In Mali, we saw there was a reference to solar power in the peace agreement itself. But I think it holds true across countries that there's a broad potential and opportunity to think of the benefits of renewable energy investment in projects through the lens of peace dividends and as a way to support the broader peace building mandates of these missions.
Thank you, Dave. And I know that's another part of the Powering Peace initiative, is to look at how to analyze the peace building impacts and make that concrete and where that's worked and where it could work. SRSG Swan, I warned I'd be back. You will have the final word. And I also want to come back to your point about needing acceleration and innovation and some sort of braveness in how we move to meet our own goals.
Yes, okay. Thank you very much. I think one of the early questions, maybe the first question, was about how to communicate that the UN is interested in procuring power from outside sources as a way to increase its use of renewables. And so I just want to say, in my view, number one, it's important to prove the concept and show it can work somewhere. And that's why I really do think that this Baidoa power purchase agreement is quite important, that we work together to make sure that this delivers and that it moves from an advanced preparation stage to final completion and actual generation of power. I think so much of the discussion around renewables and frankly around climate is at a rather broad level, and I think it can be very powerful to be able to bring it down to something quite concrete and explain to people, this is what it means, this is how it can work. So I think we must continue to focus on that. On the innovation, I want perhaps just to come back to the compact that has been signed among several UN peace operations, also with IRENA, with the Department of Operations Support, which has really been the driver of this. And again, Norway, UAE, and I believe some other partners as well. I think we are very hopeful that that mechanism can also help drive innovation. We know IRENA and the others have great expertise on how to address this problem set. And I think we are looking for an opportunity perhaps early on to identify a few specific openings where some further collaboration in the context of the compact could help highlight innovations that we could adopt. And then finally, just on innovation to note, we are genuinely committed to exploring a range of alternatives. We certainly take the point that there are local generators of power. Of course, some of our operations already draw on them, for example, in Garowe, but it will obviously continue to have to be driven by our mandated objectives and making sure that as we shift, we hope, an increased share of our power usage to renewables, that we're also preserving our ability to continue to perform the mandate. So, but we are committed to this. And again, it's another area where we hope further innovation will be possible. Thanks. And thanks again for inviting us all.
Fantastic. I hate to cut this off, but I'm excited to hear what Elizabeth Press, who is the Director of Planning and Program Support at the International Renewable Energy Agency, will have to say to us. Obviously, IRENA is a key partner in this whole effort and this initiative. And Elizabeth, taking into account all you've heard today, what do you see as a way forward project implementation for Somalia, but also more broadly? And what are lessons learned, you think, or potential lessons for missions in those countries? Over to you.
Thank you, Tori, and thank you again for organizing this event at Norway and the UAE. I feel we are creating a little bit of a community around this issue, and I'm really excited about it. And we started to have regular discussions. And as just one mentioned, I think it's really important to have a few of these proofs of concept so that we can grow it bigger and better and innovate around this based on innovations. And I also want to thank Eugene, Dave, and Abdi for the presentation. I already forwarded the report to my colleagues who are dealing with Somalia. We actually have received the request from the Minister of Energy and Water to help them with their renewable energy strategy, and we're going to start working with them on the renewable readiness assessment in next weeks. So this has been a very, very useful input so that we bring these elements into our discussion as we prepare to undertake this review with the ministry and take it from that angle to support them. And it was very important to hear what both the SRG1 and MADS have to say around what are the missing elements and where we can actually provide some maybe earlier relief to move some of these experimental projects forward. I just want to emphasize that some of the problems that exist are not unique. I mean, Eugene was talking about the sort of the externalities. They're not accounted, the way that the projects are structured, the cost and how they come. They're not unique to Somalia, and I think it's important for us to bring this element of sort of the normalcy, if you wish, in the challenge of advancing renewables-based energy system to countries that have a peacekeeping mission, because there is I think there is this broader community and conversation to be had, and bring this element of sort of commonality, if you wish, that goes beyond this subset of countries. And then the aspect of a peacekeeping operation, it really is an opening, a positive opportunity that we have in these countries to sort of give examples that can be replicated in others. So I see a great for us at IRENA, having global membership and wider view on this, we see a great opportunity of having these innovative approaches and putting our heads together to come up with different models that can be useful for other peacekeeping missions, but also way beyond that, because there's many countries they're looking for the same solutions regardless of circumstances. So we're excited, we are committed, and we will definitely be reaching out to the colleagues on this call as we enter into the deeper work with the ministry in the coming weeks, and hopefully in 6 months or so we can reconvene and have this conversation with a little bit more outcome and positive results. Thank you, Tori. Back to you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I know that Irina is working with the UN Department of Operational Support, DOS, on very specific, broad-ranging set of projects, including in the coming months with host countries about specific renewable energy projects and financing models. And I think you have some public-facing touch points, including potentially next month at the Sustainable Energy for All Forum in Kigali. And before we got on this today, I think there's also UAE is going to be hosting some events in the future. And then, of course, we have New York and elsewhere. I have to bring this to a close, unfortunately. It's a fantastic and rich discussion across multiple time zones and deep areas of expertise. I know that Powering Peace is already looking at its next case study, as well as following up on this one and what we can do specifically in Somalia. It's terrific to have the private sector involved in this conversation and understand all the potential in Somalia. Appreciate very much, SRSG Swan, your role. You've got so much on your plate, but that you made time for this today. Again, thanks to UAE and Norway for their leadership, both on and off the Security Council, and to the team behind them, who we are a pleasure to work with every day. And then finally to the author and the author's efforts with Eugene, Abdi, and my colleague Dave for the substantive work, not always easy to do, but really does try to crystallize a problem in plain sight and the many elements that we can pull together to try and address it and move forward. So with that, please stay tuned. We'll be back. And thank you for joining us today. Keep in touch and let us know if there's any questions. Any of these people will be happy to engage in the future. So thank you, everybody. And with that, I close this discussion.